my joy to introduce to you Reverend Dr. Nancy deClaissé-Walford. She is the Carolyn Ward Professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Memphis School of Theology at Mercer University in Atlanta, Georgia. She holds a bachelor's degree in ancient history from California State University in Northridge, a master's degree in Semitic languages and literature from Fuller Theological Seminary, and a PhD in biblical studies from Baylor University. Dr. deClaissé-Walford is an expert in the Hebrew language and the Psalms. There are a number of her books that for sale in the back. I would encourage you to check those out. She is the author of Reading from the Beginning, The Shaping of the Hebrew Psalter, Biblical Hebrew, an introductory textbook, Introduction to the Psalms, a song from ancient Israel, The Shape and Shaping of the Book of Psalms, the current state of scholarship, and the Book of Psalms in the New International Commentary on the Old Testament series, as well as numerous journal articles and book chapters. She has served on the editorial board of the Baptist Journal Review and expositor in various editorial capacities since 1996, and is an active participant in and part of the steering committee of the Book of Psalms section of the Society of Biblical Literature. She is also the Old Testament editor for the Word Biblical Commentary series. Within all of her scholarship, she repeatedly comes back to the question, what does this mean for the local church? A highly sought-after teacher and preacher in churches throughout the Southeast, she offers a variety of courses, lessons, and sermons on topics that include the books of Genesis and Psalms, the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, and the history of the English Bible. At McAfee, Dr. deClaissé-Walford mentors and assists students wishing to pursue doctoral education in religion. She devotes considerable time to preparing these scholars for success. The advice she offers to her students most is follow your passion. She is married to Steve, and they have 2 grown sons, a 7-year-old grandson, and 3 dogs. Steve and Nancy's passions are gardening and traveling the country in their motorhome. Join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Nancy deClaissé-Walford.
Test out which set of glasses I need to wear to be able to see what I'm doing here tonight. These will do. Okay. Good evening. I bring you greetings from the McAfee School of Theology. It's an honor to be here with you for this lecture series, and I'd like to give a special word of thanks to Dr. Stan Wood, Dr. Courtney Pace, and to, now I understand, Gina Williams for their kind hospitality in arranging my visit. I'm a student of the Book of Psalms. I've studied the book, mostly from a canonical perspective, and I'll explain that later, for the past 25 years. A couple of years ago, I was approached by a liturgical press and asked to write a commentary on the Psalms from a relatively new perspective, at least for me. The Wisdom Commentary series is examining each book of the Bible from what they call a widely feminist. And as they explained the project, I found that they were looking for not just a feminist perspective, but what I like to call a more inclusive perspective. Thus, the lectures you hear this evening and tomorrow morning are the first fruits of my attempts to read the Psalms in Book 4 of the Psalter from this more inclusive perspective. I welcome your comments and questions, and they'll probably end up in the commentary at some point. So let's get started. A journey through the Psalms, a feminist, and we could even say more inclusive reading of Psalms 90 through 92. The Psalms are a magnificent collection of human poetry. The words of our Israelite ancestors in the faith poured out in many expressions. Heartfelt lament, like we see in Psalm 22's, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me from the words of my groaning? Cries for help, as we read in Psalm 13. Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. Words of awe, as we read in Psalm 8. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? Words of admonition, Psalm 37. Do not fret because of the wicked. Do not be envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Words of hope and encouragement, Psalm 94. When I thought my foot is slipping, your steadfast love, O Lord, held me up. When the cares of my heart are many, your consolations cheer my soul. And outbursts of joyous praise, Psalm 146. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord, O my soul. I will praise the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praises to my God all my life long. The origins of the individual psalms are buried deep within the history of ancient Israel. Many appear to have oral origins, words repeated over and over again through the generations. Others appear to have written origins, poetry composed specifically for cultic and didactic functions. And it's really hard to identify definitively in many cases which are which. But the Book of Psalms has been called the hymn book of ancient Israel. Psalms appear in every reading in the Jewish prayer book, just as they do in the various lectionaries of Christian churches. They are well-loved and well-used compositions that give us some insight into humanity's understanding of God and humanity's relationship with God. And scholars have given the Book of Psalms much attention. Perhaps the most influential modern scholar of the book was one Hermann Gunkel, a German scholar who worked in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He is known as the great father, or perhaps I should say ancestor, of what we in the Guild call form criticism. Gunkel observed, as anyone might who looks closely at the Psalms, that a great variety of literary forms make up the book. He thus categorized the Psalms by type. In German, that's Gattung. Individual laments, such as we see in Psalms 3 and 7. Community laments, such as Psalms 74 and 80. Individual hymns of thanksgiving, like Psalms 34 and 116. Community hymns, Psalms 117 and 124. Wisdom psalms, Psalms 1 and 32. Royal psalms, such as Psalms 2 and 20. Enthronement psalms, like Psalms 95 and 96, and we're going to take a closer look at those tomorrow morning. Creation psalms, such as Psalms 8 and 19, and so forth. Gunkel's contribution to the study of the Psalter is immeasurable. He gave us a marvelous gift of classification that has enhanced and enriched our understanding of the great variety of poetic forms in the book. Scholars preparing lectures and manuscripts, students writing papers, clergy writing sermons and lessons, and popular authors musing on the Psalms all knowingly or unknowingly incorporate Gunkel's work on the Psalms into their own undertaking. When preparing an Easter meditation on Psalm 22, for instance, the word lament is a necessary part of the Psalm's description. And yet, the usual Hebrew word that we translate as lament, kinah, does not even appear in the Psalter. Gunkel's work was seminal. We would be the poorer without it. But as is usually the case, with every good comes some perils. And the case of Hermann Gunkel's classification of the Psalms is no different. Early in my PhD studies at Baylor University, I came across an article by Robert Polzin, at that time a professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. The article was in the journal Semea and was titled, "The Ancestress of Israel in Danger, in Danger." Notice the quote marks. "The Ancestress of Israel in Danger, in Danger." The article examines the three stories in the book of Genesis about Abraham and Isaac passing off their wives as their sisters. Polzin addresses the work of source and form critics who are attempting to, according to Polzin, resurrect the original story behind the three versions with little concern for how the stories fit into their present literary context. One sentence in the article seized my attention and has stuck with me over the years. Polzin writes, "Traditional biblical scholarship has spent most of its efforts in disassembling the works of a complicated watch before our amazed eyes. without apparently realizing that similar efforts, by and large, have not succeeded in putting the parts back together again in a significant or meaningful way. Poulsen invites us to picture a magnificent timepiece made up of cogs and wheels, springs and tiny mechanisms, delicate hands and precious stones, each with its own place in the dance of the whole. We dissect the timepiece, lay it out on a table or workbench, piece by piece. We study it and marvel at its beauty, its intricacy, and its craftsmanship. Then a passerby stops to observe our work and finally asks, "What is it?" "A watch," we reply. "Oh, well, what does it do?" the observer asks. "It keeps time," we respond. "Really? Wonderful. Show me how it works," says the passerby. And we try. We try our best, but we are unable to reassemble the watch, to restore it to the form in which we found it, so that once again it can perform the task for which it was created, to keep time. The disassembled watch, the dissected or disassembled biblical text, a wonderful metaphor. Much of the work of biblical scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries was focused on dissecting or disassembling the text, searching for strands of tradition and original oral settings. In what ways did Hermann Gunkel contribute to the dissection, particularly of the Book of Psalms? His categorization of the various types of psalms led many who studied the book to regroup the psalms into their various categories and study them together, not in psalm number order, Psalm 1, then Psalm 2, then Psalm 3, and so forth, but by type. All of the individual laments, all of the creation psalms, all of the individual hymns of thanksgiving, and so forth. In essence, students dissected the Psalter into its individual parts and largely ignored the composition as a whole in its canonical shape. The Psalter is not broken into sections by psalm type, but by books, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And in each book, we find a mix of psalm types. Book 1, for instance, Psalms 1 through 41, opens with a wisdom psalm, continues with a royal psalm, and then follows with a mix of individual laments, creation psalms, community hymns, royal psalms, and so forth. And notice that I'm using Gunkel's categorizations. Again, he gave us a great gift for understanding the Psalms. And so, a passerby stops and observes the work of form critics who study the Psalter and asks, "What is it?" And we reply, it's a collection of the voices of our ancestors in the faith expressing their joys, sorrows, petitions, questions, and awe to God. "Really," the passerby says, "wonderful. Can I have a look? Can I see?" And we lay out before them the individual laments, then the community hymns, then the creation psalms, and so forth, pristinely and discreetly ordered and categorized. But that's not how the human voice, the human emotion expresses itself. We move fluidly one moment to the next between lament and praise, awe and jadedness, joy and sorrow. And so the presentation to the passerby is sterile, devoid of true human emotion, a staunch reminder that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Some group of our ancestors in the faith shaped this book of Psalms into the form that we have it today. And that shape was not a careful division of various psalm types into chapters or books. So what do we have? How do we understand the shape of the book of Psalms? If not by psalm type, then what? What compelled the organizing of the book as we know it today? Have you ever asked yourself, why is Psalm 1 Psalm 1? And why is Psalm 150 Psalm 150? What if Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept, were Psalm 1? Or even if Psalm 150, that wonderful Alleluia song, was Psalm 1, would it make a difference? And why these 150 psalms? There were many more in circulation in ancient Israel. We have evidence from the Hebrew Bible. See Exodus 15 and Habakkuk 3, for example. Well, in the mid-20th century, Brevard Childs of Yale University championed an approach to the biblical text he called canonical criticism. His 1976 essay, Reflections on the Modern Study of the Psalms, and his 1979 book, Introduction to the Old Testament as Scripture, encouraged scholars to move away from dissecting the biblical text into its most minute components, a la Polson's wonderful watch, and move toward examining the text in the form in which it was preserved for communities of faith. That is, as a whole, as we find it in our biblical texts. He states, "The final form of the Hebrew Scriptures is what the ancient Israelites preserved, not the underlying layers of tradition of which it consists. Therefore, the best critical method for understanding its message is to study its final shape, that which became normative for all successive generations of this community of faith." James A. Sanders of Claremont University in California shared Brevard Childs' interest in studying the final form of the text. In 1977, he voiced his own call for a reevaluation of the way scholars approach biblical texts. He writes, "The biblical story has become eclipsed by the work of the very professionals in seminaries and departments of religion who seem to know the most about the Bible. The experts have lost perspective on the very object of their expertise and have reduced the Bible to grist for the historian's mill, the province of the professor's study. Each psalm in the Psalter was composed by some individual, many most likely in oral settings, as I said earlier. And each psalm may have been used in ancient Israel's worship experience. Whatever the provenance, however, each was remembered, valued, repeated, and passed on within the community of faith. Communities found value in the stories and texts of which the Hebrew Bible is composed, or those stories and texts would not have been preserved." That is, the stories and texts provided basic answers to existential questions that the people asked, including, who are we? Where did we come from? And where are we going? The ancient Israelites repeatedly asked these questions of and found answers to them in their traditions, the stories and texts that they passed on from generation to generation. Sanders steadfastly maintains that biblical texts are grounded in historical settings, that those settings can be discovered, and that they are important for understanding the shapes of texts. He writes again, "There has been a relationship between tradition, written and oral, and community, a constant, ongoing dialogue, a historical memory passed on from generation to generation, in which the special relationship between canon and community resided. Community is thus the foundation of canon. Discovering the hermeneutics of the communities that shape the traditions into canon is the foundation of the study of the shape and shaping of biblical texts." And that brings us to the next era in the study of the Book of Psalms. Gerald Wilson, a student at Yale in the 1980s, built on the works of Childs and Sanders and wrote a dissertation and subsequent book titled The Editing of the Hebrew Psalter. Basically, Wilson argues that the Psalter's 5 books, which I've listed here, evince purposeful editing, and that they told a story to the ancient Israelites, a story about their past history, their present situation, and their hope for the future. Wilson organized his study into 2 large undertakings. First, to isolate and describe whatever evidence exists of editorial activity within the Psalter, and to evaluate the extent of its unifying influence. And this is what we now call the shape of the Psalter. Second, to determine the editorial purpose that governed that organizational process, what we now call the shaping of the Psalter. He concludes that the Psalms of the Psalter were a post-exilic arrangement that narrated the history of ancient Israel, beginning with the rise of Israel under the leaderships of Kings David and Solomon in books 1 and 2, Psalms 1 through 72, continuing with the demise of the northern kingdom of Israel and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in book 3, Psalms 73 through 89, the exile in Babylon in book 4, Psalms 90 through 96, which are our focus for these lectures, and ending with the return from exile, the rebuilding of the temple, the restoration of worship, and the new hope for existence with Yahweh as sovereign in book 5, Psalms 107 through 150. The point, the message of the book, Israel can survive in its post-exilic reality if they embrace God as sovereign over them, not an earthly king of the line of David. The people have been allowed to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild their temple and to worship their God Yahweh, but they cannot have a king. They are vassals of the vast Persian Empire. The closing words of Wilson's book are, Yahweh is eternal king. Only he is ultimately worthy of trust. Human princes will wither and fade like the grass, but the steadfast love of Yahweh endures forever. Thus, the mixing of the various psalm types within the 5 books of the Psalter, rather than grouping them together by psalm type, was purposeful, part of the storytelling, if you will. Wilson succeeded, I believe, in putting that magnificent timepiece back together so that it could perform the task for which it was created. Gunkel had done his work well, had given us the tools to interpret the great variety of literary types that we encounter as we read the Book of Psalms. And Childs and Sanders and Wilson did their work well, giving us first the permission and then the tools to read the Psalter as an integrated whole, a purposefully shaped document of identity and understanding for our post-exilic ancestors in the faith. In my opinion, and not the opinion of all, with a few asides and room for scholarly idiosyncrasies, the big story, the meta-narrative of the Psalter seems agreed upon. And students of the shape and shaping of the book are now spending more time focusing on the smaller units, the so-called local narratives. The local narrative that is the focus of this session is Psalms 90 through 92. And a few introductory words then as we lead into that. Any attempt to read any portion of the psalmic text from a feminist or more inclusive perspective encounters a number of barriers. First, a voice is assigned to many psalms in their superscriptions, most often the voice of David, but also the sons of Korah, the sons of Asaph, Heman, Ethan, Solomon, and Moses. This can make it difficult to hear the voice of all humanity in the Psalms, since all those named are men, and David and Solomon are royalty. Second, many commentators locate the recitation of the Psalms at holy places by priests and kings, thus effectively removing them from the realm of common humanity. And third, the kingship of God, what I prefer to call the sovereignty of God, is a dominant image of God in the book. And we will be examining these psalms, the enthronement psalms, tomorrow. The Psalter, though, is a rich and varied collection of poetry from the life of ancient Israel that expresses a wide range of emotions and feelings. It testifies to the multifaceted dimensions of humanity's relationship with God and with one another, in all times and all places, and I maintain by all people. And while God as sovereign or king is arguably the dominant image of God in the Psalter, it is not the only image or metaphor for God in the book. William P. Brown, in Seeing the Psalms, reminds us that when a metaphor, which is precisely what the kingship or sovereignty of God is, when that metaphor becomes literalized to the point of excluding other metaphors for the same subject, the metaphor no matter how profound, becomes absolutized, as though it were itself considered ultimate. The beauty of metaphoric image for God in the Psalter is that it allows for a multiplicity of conceptualizations, or as Louis Alonso Sheppel suggests, a vast collection of interwoven images. One powerful image of God in the book of Psalms has its root in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. There God pronounces God's self-identity, and one of the words used in that pronouncement is rachum, translated most often as compassionate, as we see in the Common English Bible, the New American Standard Bible, the NIV, and the New Revised Standard, or merciful in the King James. The word derives from the root rechem, which means literally womb. Thus, God's compassion or mercy is tied closely to the concept of womb love, the love a mother feels for her yet-to-be-born child. References to God's rachum, God's womb love, occur no less than 22 times in the book of Psalms. Another prominent metaphor for God in the Psalter is that of refuge, often imaged as shelter under the wings, that kanafayim of God. We read in Psalm 17:8, "Guard me as the apple of the eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings," your kanafayim. And in 61:4, "Let me abide in your tent forever, find refuge under the shelter of your wings," your kanafayim. Protective wings bring to mind the image of a mother hen caring for her young, keeping them warm, providing shelter, and warding off predators. And we have echoes of that even in the New Testament. My students would be horrified because I use the word Jesus. Okay? As we see in, I won't let them use Jesus in the Old Testament class. As we see in Jesus' words in Matthew 22:37. Another image occurs in Psalm 131, verse 2, where we read, "I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is within me." The word translated weaned here comes from the Hebrew root gamal, which means either to treat kindly or to complete or perfect. Thus we may understand Psalm 131 to liken the calm and quiet of the psalm singer either to a suckling child who is well fed and fully satisfied, that is, treated kindly, resting peacefully in the mother's embrace. Or we may understand weaned as completed, or winged, or completed or perfected as the meaning of the verb, and see in the metaphor a child who no longer cries out in hunger for the mother's breast, but who seeks her out for her warm embrace and nurturing care. Both metaphors are powerful images of the calmness and quiet one finds in the embrace of a feminine God. Finally, wisdom is a prominent feature in the Psalter. The book equates wisdom with Torah, specifically in Psalms 1 and 119, thereby inviting the reader to hear in the wisdom psalms and the wisdom elements of the Psalms the voice of woman wisdom, the feminine iteration of Yahweh, if you will, calling humankind to search out the path to a right relationship with Yahweh through obedience to the Torah. Claudia Camp maintains, in fact, that in the Psalter, wisdom replaces the earthly king as the mediator between God and humanity. And there's another important dimension to finding the feminine in the Psalter, one's social and gendered location. A feminist interpretation of the biblical text must ask, how would a feminine gendered, and I use that term deliberately, how would a feminine gendered person read and appropriate a text? With this backstory, if you will, I now proceed to the matter at hand, finding the feminine in Psalms 90, 91, and 92. Scholars have long recognized a connectedness between the three Psalms, one that includes wisdom motifs, concern with the human condition, and finding security with Yahweh. Eric Zinger, in fact, considers Psalms 90 through 92 to be a single composition, an eine Komposition, that is linked by keyword motifs and by questions in one psalm that are answered in a following psalm. The opening psalm of Book 4, Psalm 90, is titled, in its superscription, A Prayer of Moses, the Man of God. Psalm 90, according to the storyline of the Book of Psalms that we just discussed, begins the narrative of the time of the Babylonian exile after 587, after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and the deportation of many Israelites to Babylon. But its superscription, attributing it to Moses, summons the reader or hearer back to the time of the wilderness wandering. The last time the people were outside the land of promise, waiting anxiously to enter and possess it. So 3 time frames inform the interpretation of this psalm, and indeed of Book 4. First, the initial audience of the psalm, the audience to which the final shape of the Psalter was directed, that is the post-exilic community. Those folks who have returned from exile in Babylon. That's our first time frame. Second, they are reflecting on their exilic time in Babylon, our second time frame. And third, they're called upon to remember the wilderness wanderings, the third time frame, the post-exilic period, the exilic period, and the time of the wilderness wanderings. Book 4 calls on a people wondering what their current situation is all about to reflect on their rich history as they ponder those 3 basic existential questions: who are we, where did we come from, and where are we going? The biblical narratives of the Exodus and wilderness wanderings and the narratives of the Babylonian exile offer us little information about the Israelite women and children. But we must not forget that they, as well as the men, endured the hardships of both the Exodus and the exile and carried the memories with them. Psalm 90 employs some interesting feminine imagery that I suggest would not have been lost on those post-exilic hearers of this psalm. The words of verse 2 are particularly evocative. I'm going to give you the New Revised Translation first, but the Masoretic text says, and this is my translation, "Before the mountains were born, then you, God, writhed in labor." And here the verbal root is chil. You, God, writhed in labor, birthing the earth and the inhabited world. The basic meaning of chil is to twirl, twist, or writhe, and nearly every occurrence in the Hebrew Bible is in direct reference to the birthing process. And where it is not, it usually connotes writhing, anguish, and great distress. Verse 2 of Psalm 90 depicts the Creator God writhing in childbirth, bringing forth the world. Yet many of the most popular English translations of Psalm 90 fail to convey fully the rich meaning of chil. Oops. Let me go back one. This one out. Okay, hang on. The joys of PowerPoint. Yet many of the most popular English translations of Psalm 90 fail to convey fully the rich meaning of chil. The Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version read, "you formed," while the New International Version and the JPS Tanakh have "you brought forth." The Common English Bible happily has "you birthed," and the New American Standard Bible, "you gave birth." Now this slide. In verse 3, the psalm singer reminds God of the fragility of human life. "You turned humankind, Anosh, back to dust, and say, 'Turn back, you mortals, B'nai Adam.'" The 2 words used of humanity in this verse are the same as those found in Psalms 8 and 144, psalms that ponder humanity's place within the created order. Verses 5 and 6 continue the psalmist's musing over the fragility of human life. "You sweep them," and we learn that is our years back from verse 4. "You sweep them away. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers." Now, while all members of the Israelite community, of course, were concerned with the survival of the people, a reading of this verse from a feminist viewpoint highlights the vulnerability of the unborn, newborn, and young children and their mothers during difficult times. Infant and mother mortality rates were high in the ancient Near East. I suggest that when a woman, and I think even a man, in post-exilic Jerusalem heard the words of Psalm 90, her mind conjured up images of the great vulnerability of women, newborns, and young children, each of whom were important keys to the survival of ongoing generations, and a reminder of the empathy of a God who painstakingly gave birth to the world, gave birth to the earth, and inhabited world. The central focus of Psalm 90, in the opinion of many scholars, is verses 11 and 12. The psalmist acknowledges the strength, the oaths of God's anger, and requests that God teach us to number our days. And then we will approach what we do with a heart of wisdom, a levav chokmah. Again, my translation. The phrase, a heart of wisdom, levav chokmah, is unique in the Hebrew Bible to Psalm 90. But interestingly, the phrase wise of heart, so just a slight twist on the phrase, is used 4 times in the Exodus narratives to describe the craftspersons who constructed the tabernacle and fashioned its furnishings. So keep that in mind. In Psalm 90, verse 14, the song singer continues by asking God to satisfy Savah us in the morning. Do the words of Psalm 90, verse 12, and we will approach what we do with a heart of wisdom, elavav, chokmah, and the words of verse 14, satisfy us, Savah, suggest that the people, including and perhaps especially the women who daily face the endless tasks before them, were being admonished to be content with whatever chores and endeavors confronted them on a daily basis. Eric Zenger writes this of Psalm 90. If wisdom means the art of living, then the ability here asked of God to say yes to life and live that yes in the midst of the many things that deserve a no is wisdom's art of living par excellence. Wisdom, the art of living. The closing words of Psalm 90 appear to validate such an understanding of a heart of wisdom. The psalm singer cries out, confirm for us the work of our hands. Yes, the work of our hands confirm. We move on now to Psalm 91. It opens with vivid imagery of a God who shelters, delivers, and provides refuge. Verse 1 states that the one who lives in the shelter of Elyon, usually translated Most High, will lodge in the shadow of Shaddai, usually translated Almighty. Some suggest that the basic meaning of the word Shaddai is breast, from the Hebrew root shad, while others maintain that mountain is the reference for Shaddai, and thus understand Shaddai as God of the mountains. But let's move backwards to Psalm 90, verse 2, and forward to Psalm 91, verse 4, that we haven't quite come to yet, as we attempt to find a meaning for Psalm 91's use of Shaddai. Recall that Psalm 90, verse 2 depicts God writhing in childbirth, to bring forth the earth and the inhabitable world. And in verses 3, 12, and 14, the psalmist requests that God give mere humanity, Enosh and B'nai Adam, a heart of wisdom, levav chokmah, and that God satisfy, savah, humanity. I suggest we are permitted to understand the epithet Shaddai in Psalm 91 as a reference, even if a veiled one, to the nurturing, nourishing God who writhed in childbirth to bring forth the earth, Psalm 90, verse 2, and now suckles it at the breast, that is, satisfies it as it learns to have a heart of wisdom, Psalm 90, verse 12. References that tie nurturing breasts to God and God's goodness are numerous in the Hebrew Bible. Genesis 49:25, the poem of Jacob's blessing of his sons, in this instance Joseph, connects the blessing of Shaddai with the breasts, Shaddaiim, and the womb, Rachman. Remember that word? In Isaiah 66:1, Zion is a consoling breast, Shad. And Naomi states in Ruth chapter 1, verses 20 and 21, Shaddai has dealt bitterly with me and brought calamity upon me. A reflection perhaps on her now barren state. Both of her sons have died and she has no grandsons. Verses 3 and 4 of Psalm 91 employ avian imagery to depict the dangers that especially threaten young birds, the fowler snare and the threat of predators, to provide assurance that God will shelter the psalmists with protective wings and pinions and ensure safety and nurturing. While there are varied understandings of winged God images in the ancient Near East, I believe that in the context of Psalms 90 and 91, Yahweh's winged protection in Psalm 91, verse 4, is best understood as the protection a mother gives to the child whom she has borne, suckled, and taught to live with wisdom in a world where adversity presents itself on every side. Thus the psalmist will not fear, in the words of verses 5 and 6, the terror and pestilence of the night, or the arrow and destruction of the day. God's repeated promise to care for and protect the psalm singer leads to the declaration in verses 14 through 16 that God will finally satisfy Salah, the very request made by the psalmist in Psalm 90, verse 14. So the request in Psalm 90 answered by the satisfaction in Psalm 91. Psalm 92 contains many ties to Psalms 90 and 91, but I think the words of verse 12 and following are Psalm 92 contains many ties to Psalms 90 and 91, but the words of verse 12 and following are particularly intriguing from a gender standpoint. In verse 12, the righteous are likened to the palm tree and the cedar of Lebanon. I suggest that what we have here are two common images of strength and longevity from the ancient Near East, set alongside one another in poetic parallelism, one feminine and one masculine. The palm tree mentioned here, the Hebrew word is tamar, is most likely the date palm, a long-lived tree that provided many staple items of the ancient Near Eastern diet of both humans and animals, as well as wood for various household projects. It is a symbol of life-giving water in the biblical text. Recall that just after crossing the Reed Sea, the wandering Israelites came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. Tamar, we better know as Tamar, is of course the name of three significant biblical characters. The word is used in Song of Songs, chapter 7, verses 7 and 8, as a metaphor for the woman sought by the lover. We read in the New Revised Version, "You are stately as a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters. I say I will climb the palm tree and lay hold of its branches. Oh, may your breasts be like clusters of the vines, and the scent of your breath like apples." In Judges 4:5, we read that Deborah sat under a palm tree as she judged Israel. The palm tree, thus, seems to be associated in the Hebrew Bible with the feminine and fertility and strength. The cedar of Lebanon, and the Hebrew there is eris, convey a more masculine imagery. Cedars were connected with longevity, majesty, strength, and were symbols of royal power. Recall that according to 2 Samuel 5:11 and 7:2, David's temporary housing for the tabernacle, and according to 1 Kings 5:6 through 10, Solomon's choice of building material for the temple, were both the cedars of Lebanon. The palm tree and the cedar of Lebanon, thus, were two powerful images of the strength and resilience of the people of God, one overtly feminine and the other seemingly masculine. The singer of Psalm 92 celebrates the works of God's hands, verse 4. For you, O Lord, have made me glad by your work. At the works of your hands I sing for joy. Echoing the words of Psalm 90, verse 17, confirm for us the work of our hands. Yes, the work of our hands confirm. The psalm continues in verse 15 with assurance to the righteous that they will be planted in the house of Yahweh and thrive in its courtyards. And tuck that one away for tomorrow. Further, they will sprout in old age and be full of sap and succulent green. The promised fertility of the righteous in Psalm 92 thus renders null and void the words of Psalm 90, verses 5 and 6 that say, you sweep our years away, they are like a dream. Like grass that is renewed in the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. No, they flourish. In old age they still produce fruit. They are always green and full of sap. I suggest again that those especially concerned with the vulnerability of the young, the newborn, and yet to be born, that is the survival of the exilic and post-exilic communities, heard in the words of Psalm 92, assurance that the next generation would indeed survive, if the people embrace the heart of wisdom for which the singer of Psalm 90 asks. Psalms 90 through 92 are words of assurance to all members of the exilic, the post-exilic, and all communities today that God creates, nourishes, protects, and teaches us to have a heart of wisdom, elevav chokmah, and then ultimately satisfies, sabah, regardless of life's exigencies. Tomorrow we're going to examine the enthronement psalms, Psalms 93 through 99, through a widely feminist, or I prefer, inclusive lens. And perhaps they will provide us with more fodder as we develop our hearts of wisdom. Thank you.